Like, if you're in the first 5 rows, you only have to come up 1 row, but if you're like all the way in the back, you have to come up like 3 rows. And if you do that, you get a magazine. So there's a treat at the end of it for you. That's great. Wow, you guys are wonderful. You can pass around. Toys. Oh, you're so great. And I think this means I don't think it's tonight. You can have one if you want it, or give it away to a friend. So I'm an author and an editor, and I do a bunch of other things. One of the main things I do is edit Color Lines, which is the toy that you're getting. The Color Lines also has a blog called racewire.org, and I encourage you to go on there. It's sort of a roundup of news on race and politics. Do I need to use the microphone? Do I need to use the microphone? No, everybody can hear me? Is that okay then? Okay, cool. Excellent. I want to talk with you today about social justice in media and race and feminism. Can everyone hear me? Let's see if we're projecting them. Great. I discovered the power of media when I was in elementary school. I was one of these like bratty kids who did really well in school and loved getting assignments to like write essays and write op-eds and things like that. And in I think it was around 5th grade, our teacher gave us an assignment to write an op-ed, basically arguing whether there was human life on like planet Neptune or something. Whether there was alien life, whether there was alien life. And I was like, no problem, because I was growing up, we were like the second Latina family in a white neighborhood, and I felt like an alien. So I could totally make an argument for why there were aliens on other planets. And the word alien was a very odd word in my world growing up. We only spoke Spanish at home, and obviously everything in public was in English. And there were people in my family who were identified as aliens, right? So one time I was at the store with my uncle. My mom is from Colombia, and all my aunties are from Colombia, and my dad is from Cuba. And one of my aunties had married a guy from Peru, really sweetheart, one of my just beloved uncles. And we were at the store. He was making a huge purchase. He was using a credit card. They asked him for his ID. And I was going through that phase. You know how kids go through that phase where they want to see everything in like the wallet and the pocketbook and all that? So I was going through that phase, and I was pulling on his arm and saying, I want to see your ID, And I think I was expecting, my dad had a sort of a driver's license or a DMV kind of ID card. So I thought that's what I was going to see. And instead, when he brought down the card and showed it to me, it was his cute face, and he was really dorky and had like, humongous glasses and everything. And it was his little face. And then the words resident alien ran across the top, which is how the federal government would identify his legal status in this country. And because I was so young and learning English in a very awkward way, right? Because I was learning English at school, so when you're learning English at school, you're sort of like catching as catch can, you're not sort of getting everything. And I just thought, this is really weird. So when I got to write this essay or this op-ed, it was pretty easy. I was like, oh yeah, there's definitely alien life on other planets because, we're here in this country, dude. So I handed it in, and, I think it was a few days later, maybe even the next day, the teacher read it aloud to the class. And the other kids in the class were nodding their heads, and she was talking about what a good argument it was for alien life existing on planet Neptune. And I just saw that I had just convinced a room full of people about something. And I just thought, if I can convince these fools that there's alien life on planet Neptune, I can do anything. And that kind of started me off in media work. And I kind of thought, I would grow up and basically take over the planet. And it got a little bit more complicated, as you can imagine. I went to graduate school. I got my graduate degree in journalism and Latin American studies, worked in book publishing, etc., and got an amazing opportunity to do an internship at the New York Times on their Metro desk, which was really, really exciting. I thought it was going to be so glamorous, and it was for about 5 to 6 minutes. And then I was covering the local stories, and I was writing about, I actually did a story about how much rain there was on a particular day, and how people felt about that. That was one of my exciting stories of the day. And I was writing a lot about fires, and we got rotated. I was an intern, so we got rotated on police beats. And we got to write and report on some pretty, difficult stories, including police brutality stories and kids, shooting each other in the projects. It was pretty tough stuff. I worked with an amazing editor who gave me a wonderful assignment, which was to do a follow-up story on a woman who had been shot herself. And the story was The story was of Angela, a woman by the name of Angela Riddick. And Angela was 26 years old in an abusive relationship with a man. There was sort of a long history, you know, of physical abuse and verbal abuse, etc. She had never pressed charges against him. She broke up with him and tried to get away. He showed up at, his name was Cain Cassidy. He showed up at her home and put a bullet through the front door of like her apartment. He showed up at her job and shot out of her car, and then took the police on a big chase through town. And they caught him, you know, the car chase ended and they caught him and brought him, you know, arrested him, and when he came up for bail, he was let go on bail. And part of the challenge was sort of, one of the things that I was trying to do was sort of, why was he let go when there was a history of domestic violence, and what communication gaps had happened? And there was a communication gap because the car chase happened in one county, and the domestic violence happened in a different county, and there wasn't communication between the two police departments. And even though this police department knew that there was a history of domestic violence, they didn't think that there was enough evidence there to keep him. Unfortunately, Cain showed up at Angela's home one day, and this time did succeed in shooting her, shot her in the left eye, left her partially paralyzed, and then he himself went to the parking lot of a local Toys R Us and killed himself with a shot to the head. So when I was doing this story, I was talking to domestic violence advocates, I was talking to the police themselves, of course, talking to her family. She was still in critical condition, so she couldn't speak for her part of the story. And one of the things that one of the police officers told me was, you know, well, Angela never told me she was getting beat up, you know, so there was nothing we could do. I didn't know about it. And I thought, well, that's interesting, you know, who knows if that's true, because Angela can't speak for herself right now. When I went and told my fabulous editor, who I love this guy, he was teaching me so much, it was really a great mentor. When I went and told him, and I was, you know, recounting everything, you know, the way media stuff works, you're reporting your story, and you're checking in with your editor, especially when it's sort of a little bit of a longer assignment, how things are developing and how you're thinking of writing the story and what you're finding. But when I got to the part about Angela, this sort of accusation that Angela may not have told the full picture, you know, he just completely stopped and was like, wait, you know, Angela is complicit then. Angela is partly to blame about what's happened here. And it was a very intense moment for me, because it had never occurred to me that she was somehow complicit. I had a very different perspective. He was very much, obviously, having a judgment. I had a different judgment, perhaps, in this situation. And what it did for me was, you know, it sort of was my confrontation with, oh, this is how media works. You know, this is how it is sort of behind the scenes. And made me realize, you know, the degree to which, and I think we all sort of know this, but it's maybe a little bit different when you're working in it, or maybe because I was younger, less jaded, I was more idealistic. But the degree to which media is an industry built on judgment, right? And that a lot of what we do every day, and a lot of what you're consuming as readers, you know, if you're not producing media, a lot of it is sort of something has happened, and is it a good thing or a bad thing? Stimulus package, good or bad? You know, AIG bonuses, good or bad? You know, luckily, I think we've all decided bad. But we do very much work in those categories of good and bad. And especially when it comes to marginalized communities and social justice issues, it's very much the good and the bad, right? Maybe some of you have followed the story of a young man in Long Island, Marcelo Lucero. He was a young immigrant who was pretty brutally killed by a group of teenagers. And his story is really interesting to me, the way the media has covered it, because he's put in the good immigrant category. So Marcelo was a young man, you know, like, I mean, sort of your traditional immigrant story, you know, crossed the border, came here to make money, sent back to his mother in the home country, pretty much sort of kept himself. I think he had a brother here that he lived with. And in his particular town in Long Island, there was a group of teenagers who, you know, on Friday nights, what they did was get together, drink beer, and harass anybody who they thought was a Latino immigrant. And they called it beaner hopping. That's what they did. So on one particular night, they had already harassed one guy, sort of throwing bottles at him, something like that. I think harassed two different guys. By the time they got to Marcelo, I think there was a lot more drinking, things at high interest level, and he was stabbed to death by these group of teenagers. And the way the media has reported on it, actually the media has done a really great job in a lot of ways because it's gone in to get the stories of the immigrant community actually, which is really wonderful. But it's very much painted Marcelo as a good immigrant, and kind of you read these stories and you're thinking, well, what if he would have had a DUI? Or what if, I mean, he probably would have been deported at that point, but let's just say, what if he had had sort of, you know, a record of something, you know? What if it had not been sort of a very clean, you know, the sort of good victim, you know? Would we be getting these stories from the community? And I think the answer is no, you know, and it's definitely, because I do social justice media now, which means that I work more closely with advocates and activists, it's also a struggle within the immigrant community, right? How do we talk with the media and how do we present our community when not everybody's an angel, you know, not everyone is perfect, you know, and how do we still, you know, hold true to that, you know, even if Marcelo had not been a perfect victim in some way, does that mean he deserved to be killed? No, obviously, you know, obviously not. But so much of the rhetoric that we have in the media about immigrants is very much, it's such a sort of bad, it's sort of a bad judgment. You know, we usually put immigrants in the bad category. So to come back to Angela's story, for me, you know, there was definitely clearly some judgment happening there, and I think probably, you know, a lot of you have read about more recently Chris Brown and Rihanna, and probably you have your own judgments about what's happened there. And I was really, really lucky that by the time I got to the point where I was at the Times for an internship, I had already worked with amazing feminists in media. So, how many people in the room are feminists? Self-identified? Okay. Yay! Okay, great. Cool. So, I'll still do my little pitch for feminism, even though there's a lot of you. I know that a lot of times when I talk to folks, when I say the word feminist, the first image is like woman with hairy armpits, doesn't like lipstick, hates men, most likely a lesbian. And I encourage you, you know, if you sort of feel like you have questions about feminism, you know, and you want to talk privately, come to me afterwards. And that actually happens at a lot of colleges. And at a recent one, someone came up to me and said, you know, I heard that most of you are lesbians, you know? And that was great. That was a great conversation starter, you know? And it was like, yeah, some of us are. And some of us are not, you know, lesbians happen to be everywhere, you know, as bisexuals are everywhere, etc., and gay men. So, for me, I know that probably one of the things that, you know, if you don't have that sort of negative experience around feminism, sometimes it's sort of boiled, when you hear the word feminism, it's boiled down to the idea of just equality between men and women, which, and I'm going to be really honest with you, when I first came into contact with feminism, that's how it was very much presented to me. And I didn't buy it, you know. That was so weird to me, right? Because in my community, men were like, the last to be hired, the first to be fired. They were getting targeted on the street because they didn't talk English or they were too brown. You know, we're trying to make sure they stay out of prison. You know, so to me, I was like, I don't want to be equal to that. You know, that doesn't look too good. You know, so the whole idea of equality as a way to define feminism didn't really resonate with me. What did resonate was feminists, and very much women of color feminists, very much racial justice activists, who said, you know, you matter, you know, and what you think and your experience matters and is connected to a much larger picture. And that to me, that process was what sort of began to hook me into what feminism is for me, you know, and that included, you know, our feminism is about creating a community where it's better for our men too, you know. It's not just about like, oh, we're going to try and make the situation better for women and we're going to leave men behind. Men are very much a part of how I came to define feminism. Feminists were also the first people in my life who were very explicit about, you know, we're going to get more done together than alone, you know, which was great for me because I'm Latina and we don't do anything alone. I was just telling somebody I moved out here from Jersey, and that's probably the most alone thing I've ever done. But we were definitely like a tribal people. And I felt like feminists had taken that Latino idea and really ran with it. Feminists were also people who, to me, you know, and this is something that is, I think, true for a lot of folks who commit themselves to social justice work, were saying, you know, I'm going to have judgments perhaps about what you've done, and I'm not going to let my judgment get in the way. You know, I'm not going to let my judgment get in the way of making this a better community for all of us. And so feminists were definitely the first people who were like, you know, maybe you're going to get back at that guy. I think that's crazy. I think that's crazy, but, you know, let's talk about getting you out of crisis. Let's focus, you know, like, oh, you're doing that. I don't agree with that, but let's organize and take back the march, you know, protest, start a school, you know, or, wow, you're in that situation and, you know, I think you could have made a different decision, but like, here's a book, or here's a video, or here's a story of another person who's been in that situation. And to me, feminists were also the first people who really helped me to connect into a much larger issue, so that when I was looking, by the time I got to sort of Angela's story, you know, I very much, you know, felt like I understood, and perhaps all of you do understand, that we still very much live in a world where violence against women is very much an ordinary part of life and a very accepted part of life, unfortunately. And so that when I looked at Angela, you know, I could see that, first of all, it's like a lot of the women in our community, we're not going to press charges, we don't want to send our men to prison, and that's unfortunately the only option that is usually available. But what I tried to struggle with my editor to say is, you know, she still had a right to be safe. Like, even if she hadn't spoken up for herself, even if she hadn't pressed charges, even if she hadn't done all of this, you know, I know as a feminist and as a social justice activist that she had a right to be safe, that all of us do. And that's what feminism means to me, in a nutshell, or in a long nutshell. And I also have to admit that I brought to my feminism a very personal experience, and when I was reporting on Angela's story, brought a lot of empathy myself, because my mother was very much like Angela, you know. My dad was extremely abusive with me. My mother never pressed charges, you know. She was not going to send the man she loved to prison, and I didn't want her to either, you know. He was also our main breadwinner. So when I came to Angela's story and I was trying to explain it to my editor, I was like, no, you don't understand. There's like all this happening over here. And I'm happy to say that, you know, he got it, and I very much got to include the voices of advocates in my stories. And so I cannot begin to tell you, for any of you who go into the field of social work or advocacy, you are so important to people who do media. You know, we really rely on you to speak when people themselves can't speak, as in the case of Angela. I want to talk about how social justice movements have changed the way that we've told stories. And our stories have changed a lot in the last 50 years, and I haven't been around for 50 years, I totally admit this, but I've thought about this a lot, and I've talked to a lot of people, and I've taken notes, so you can actually really trust me when I say this. They've changed a lot, and I've created a little continuum in which I see the way narratives have changed. And I do start, the beginning point are social justice movements. And if we think about social justice movements, so here I'm talking about civil rights, I'm talking about women's movements, LGBT, all these movements, 60s and 70s, right? In a very cohesive way, were movements. You know, and they did many things, including obviously a lot of work in the courts, a lot of work on the streets. But one of the things that they did that I think sometimes doesn't get fully appreciated is that they really started to change the way that we told stories to one another, about each other. They started to say, you know, people on the margins deserve to be in the center, and we need to hear those stories, and those stories are valuable. They also prioritized hearing a more personal voice about a larger systemic problem, you know, sort of putting a human face and using that as a way to connect each other. And then, of course, you have hip-hop, you know, culture and music, which is what I'm a part of, which was very much, of course, like, if you're not familiar with it, like sort of a talking back. I mean, it's sort of hip-hop cultures everywhere now, but like very much, you know, in sort of its origins, a talking back and an improvisation and a pushing against systems in its own way. From there, you had the move to, you know, where I put on this continuum is something that happens in literature, which people don't necessarily wouldn't put on this continuum or think about. But I put on there the rise of the memoir. And part of the reason that I put that on there is, you know, the memoir, you think, well, I haven't read a memoir. Well, you've seen the movies, you know. You've seen movies, you've probably seen it at Oprah, because, you know, now all the memoirs are false and untrue. But I think that the rise of the memoir is really, really interesting, because you have movements that say, our stories matter, let's bring it to the center. You have a talking back and a pushing back, and then you have memoirs that are essentially sort of very intimate stories. Like they're sort of, to me, it reflects the need which our country has to actually hear real stories, to sort of speak directly to one another. And so out of that, it's not a surprise that you also get, well, you know, now blogs and YouTube, you know, and people, you know, I've met folks who, you know, from the 60s and 70s who hate YouTube, and like YouTube folks who don't get the 60s thing, you know. And I'm like, you couldn't have happened. You know what I mean? There's sort of like there's a really strong relationship there in the way that we use now YouTube and Facebook, and I would put all sort of the Web 2.0 to speak very directly to one another. And I think that we are having more communication than we ever have before, and it's a really exciting time to be creating media because the power is very much in our hands in a way that you saw there in the 60s and 70s. I don't know how many people have read This Bridge Called My Back. It's an anthology by women of color in 1980. Okay, not a lot of people. I really recommend it, but you know, that was sort of, you know, that's like early YouTube in the sense of like people running around, you know, trying to get each other's stories, putting them in a book, at a kitchen table, printing them out. It's very much like do it yourself. So we are, I think, very much talking more to one another and very much talking more about race and I think issues of social justice. But of course, talking more and having more contact doesn't necessarily mean that we're always doing it better. I think election night, most of you were probably tuned in, I'm going to assume, since it was so historic. And I don't think the votes had been completely even called for Obama, but pundits were already like, well, racism is over now. You know, nobody can ever say that racism got in the way, you know? And I was telling a friend that if it would have been Hillary, it would have been like, sexism is over. Women cannot say that that their gender has gotten in the way. And instead of a sort of post-racial, we would probably have been hearing about a post-feminism, and feminism would have been dead again. You know, it's been dead like 3 times, I think, in like the last 20 years. So I think that there's about 5 things that we could be doing better in terms of talking about race and feminism. The first one is that I think we could get more clear about what racism is ourselves. There's a great comedian, Kamau Bell. His show is called the Kamau Bell Curve Show, I think. It's in San Francisco, and I really recommend you to check it out. I think it's still playing. You can find him online. And he has a really interesting joke that I think is just right on. He says, you know, most people think about racism in 2 ways. The first one is a white guy who gets in the pickup truck and drags a black man to his death. He's like, let's call that Texas racism. He's like, and the other kind of racism is like 2 guys are at the cooler and they're like, oh, did you meet the new guy in the mailroom or whatever? And the other guy's like, no, I can't remember his name. I don't think he's Puerto Rican. Why you gotta say he's Puerto Rican? Why you gotta make it about race, you know? That could be called Berkeley racism, where it's extremely interpersonal. And it's really jarring. Like when you put those 2 side by side, it's like horrible, dramatic act that no one, you know, would ever argue, you know, is racist. And it's very, very clear, right?